As early cities expanded and populations grew denser, the simple systems that once governed small communities began to fail. Personal authority, tradition, and informal leadership were no longer enough to maintain order among thousands of individuals living side by side. Disputes over land, resources, and status became more frequent, and without a shared framework to resolve conflicts, instability threatened the survival of these growing settlements. It was during this critical moment in human history that societies began to develop the earliest forms of organized rules, marking the transition from communal order to structured authority. These early rules were not yet complex legal codes, but they represented a powerful shift in how power was exercised. Customs that had once been passed down orally were formalized, enforced by leaders and councils who claimed the right to judge and punish. The idea of justice emerged, not as an abstract concept, but as a practical tool to preserve harmony and prevent chaos. By defining acceptable behavior and consequences, early societies created predictability, allowing people to coexist within increasingly complex environments. Leadership itself began to change in response to this new reality. Authority was no longer based solely on strength or spiritual influence, but on the ability to manage order and enforce rules. Elders, chiefs, and councils gained prominence as decision-makers, mediating disputes and coordinating collective efforts. These figures represented the early foundations of governance, where power became tied to responsibility and administration rather than individual dominance. This transformation marked the first step toward institutional authority. Economic activity further reinforced the need for structure. As trade expanded and surplus resources accumulated, conflicts over ownership and distribution became unavoidable. Leaders began to regulate markets, storage, and exchanges, ensuring that resources were allocated in a way that sustained the community. Control over food supplies and trade routes became a source of power, strengthening those who could organize and protect economic systems. The management of wealth became inseparable from political authority, laying the groundwork for centralized control. Religion and belief systems also played a crucial role during this period of transition. Rules and decisions were often justified through spiritual narratives, portraying order as a divine necessity rather than a human invention. Rituals and ceremonies reinforced obedience and unity, embedding authority into the cultural identity of the community. By linking power to the sacred, early leaders ensured compliance and legitimacy, reducing resistance and reinforcing social cohesion. This phase of human history represents a turning point where power began to move beyond individuals and into systems. The emergence of shared rules, organized leadership, and regulated economies allowed early cities to survive internal pressures and external threats. These developments did not yet form full states, but they established the foundations upon which future governments, laws, and empires would be built. In understanding this transition, we uncover the origins of organized power that continue to shape the world today. As early systems of rules began to stabilize growing cities, power increasingly shifted toward those who controlled resources rather than those who merely enforced order. Food surpluses, tools, land, and trade goods became the true foundations of authority. Managing these resources required organization, planning, and record-keeping, leading to the rise of early administrators and scribes. These individuals did not wield weapons or spiritual power, yet their influence was immense, as they controlled information, distribution, and access. For the first time in human history, power became inseparable from economic management. Trade, once informal and based on trust, transformed into a regulated system. Markets operated under supervision with standardized measures, controlled exchanges, and designated spaces for commerce. Leaders imposed rules to prevent conflict, ensure fairness, and protect surplus goods. Storage facilities and granaries became strategic assets, guarded and monitored to secure the city's survival during scarcity. Those who oversaw these systems gained authority not through force, but through coordination and control, marking a decisive evolution in how societies function. This period also saw the emergence of early taxation. Contributions of grain, labor, or goods were demanded in exchange for protection, infrastructure, and stability. While these obligations strengthened the city, they also deepened social divisions. A clear distinction formed between those who manage resources and those who produce them. Farmers, artisans, and laborers became dependent on centralized systems, while administrators and leaders consolidated influence. Economic dependency quietly reinforced political authority, making obedience not just a rule, but a necessity. Record keeping played a crucial role in this transformation. Symbols, markings, and early writing systems emerged as tools of governance, allowing leaders to track resources, agreements, and obligations. Information became power. Those who could read, write, and interpret records held an advantage, shaping decisions that affected entire populations. This shift marked the birth of bureaucracy, where authority extended beyond individuals and into systems that could persist over time, regardless of who ruled. As economic structures solidified, enforcement mechanisms followed. Guards and overseers ensured compliance with regulations, protected storage areas, and maintained order in marketplaces. Unlike earlier forms of leadership, this authority was constant and institutional. Power no longer depended on presence or personal strength. It operated continuously through rules, records, and controlled access to resources. The city itself became an instrument of power, shaping behavior through structure rather than coercion alone. This stage in human development represents a critical transformation. Societies were no longer bound solely by tradition or communal trust, but by systems designed to manage complexity at scale. Economic control, administration, and record-keeping laid the groundwork for centralized governance, enabling cities to expand, endure, and dominate their surroundings. These mechanisms would soon merge with ideology, religion, and military force, giving rise to fully organized states and eventually the first empires. But at this moment, power was built quietly through organization, control, and the management of human effort. As cities grew more complex, control no longer depended only on rules or administration. It required something deeper: obedience. At first, authority was justified by necessity. Rules existed to prevent chaos. Administration existed to manage resources. But over time, power began to shift. Leaders were no longer seen as organizers. They became figures above the population. This transformation was subtle. It did not happen through a single event or revolution. It happened through repetition, routine, and belief. People began to accept that some voices mattered more than others, that certain individuals had the right to decide, to judge, to command. Symbols of power started to appear everywhere: elevated buildings, exclusive spaces, distinct clothing, seals, banners, and ceremonial objects. These were not decorative choices. They were psychological tools. Power became visible. When authority can be seen, it becomes harder to question. The city itself was redesigned to reinforce hierarchy. Central areas became places of command. Peripheral zones became places of labor. Movement was no longer equal. Some paths were restricted. Some doors were closed. And with this spatial control came social separation. Those who governed lived differently from those who worked. They ate differently. They slept differently. They were protected. The concept of privilege was born. At the same time, punishment became more structured, no longer spontaneous or personal, but formal. Rules were enforced through consequences, public consequences. Fear became part of governance. not constant violence, but the possibility of it. People learned not only what to do, but what not to question. This system was incredibly effective, so effective that it spread. Other settlements observed, copied, adapted. Control became a model. And yet, something else happened beneath the surface. As authority centralized, trust began to erode. Communal responsibility weakened. Decisions felt distant. The city was no longer us. It became them, the rulers and the ruled. This division marked a turning point in human history. Civilization had achieved order, but it had also created distance. Efficiency replaced participation. Stability replaced equality. The city stood strong, but the cost was invisible. For the first time, humans lived under systems they did not fully control, systems that shaped their lives from above. This was not the end of progress, but it was the beginning of something new, a world where power could outlive the people who created it. And once power becomes permanent, it never stays neutral. As these early cities grew more complex, power stopped being something that people could see directly or challenge easily. It no longer lived only in the strength of a leader or the respect earned through wisdom. Power became embedded in structures, routines, and invisible systems that shaped daily life without constant confrontation. Laws were no longer negotiated face to face. They were recorded, repeated, enforced by roles rather than individuals. Authority became distant, abstract, and increasingly unquestionable. For the average citizen, power was no longer a person to appeal to, but a system to survive within. This separation changed human psychology forever. People learned to obey rules they did not create, to work for outcomes they would never fully control, and to accept hierarchies that felt permanent rather than temporary. The rulers, now physically and symbolically elevated, no longer needed to justify their position daily. Their dominance was reinforced by architecture, ritual, economy, and control of information. Over time, this imbalance normalized inequality. What once might have felt unjust began to feel inevitable. Generations were born into systems where obedience was taught before questioning, where loyalty to order outweighed loyalty to community. This marked a critical turning point in human history, the moment power stopped being shared experience and became centralized authority. From here, civilizations would expand rapidly, but at a cost. Stability would increase, but freedom would narrow. Innovation would accelerate, but only under permission. And while these early systems allowed humanity to build wonders, they also planted the seeds of conflict, rebellion, and collapse. Because once power becomes distant, it also becomes fragile. The more it separates itself from the people below, the more it relies on control rather than trust. And history shows us that such systems, no matter how strong they appear, are always temporary. This is the foundation upon which empires will rise, clash, and fall. And in the next chapter, we will see how centralized power evolves into organized states, warfare, and the first true struggles for dominance between civilizations, setting the stage for the world as we know it today.